Hi, this is Spencer McGreal. Today is 9/11. Happy 9/11. I was alive when 9/11 happened. I remember I was home from school because my parents were setting up a new school. I grew up on the south side of Chicago, and they didn't want me to go to the public schools because they were too dangerous. And that might be something that comes up in this video that we're watching today. But Charlie Kirk was shot in the neck yesterday, assassinated, and I thought I'd do something different today. I thought I would watch one of the alternate hypothesis videos because there's no time like the present. You might as well jump to something you're really interested in. This is my favorite video of his. Well, it's one of two that I really enjoy. The other one is Conceived in White Nationalism, which both of these videos presented information that I had no idea about. It's right to say that these videos kind of changed my life. And so we're just going to go through it. I'm just going to comment on if there's anything I feel like commenting on.
One thing that
If you haven't seen this video before, please check it out. You can see the URL on the screen. Myth of Prejudice. Great video.
always stuck out at me like a sore thumb was how the white people in very lily white states will lecture whites in the southeast U.S. just how bad their negative views of black people are. And this always seemed a glaring falsification of the idea of prejudice, that white people with greater proximity towards blacks, but presumably this would work with other races, have a more negative view of those races than those whose views of other races is delivered to them electronically or is informed by that black family that lives in their otherwise all-white neighborhood. And we've been over South Africa, how white people in the United Kingdom or in Holland and Western Europe sat in moral judgment with radically different views about what was going on in majority black South Africa and how mean and prejudiced the whites in South Africa were being to set up laws designed to quarantine.
Do you really know black people if you never live around them? I like Ryan Falk here using the term your views on black people are delivered to you digitally. Because I feel like that's how most of the people like in Vermont or even like Chicago. So Chicago is heavily divided by race. It's very, sectioned off by race. It's funny because when I lived in Chicago, you were always a Democrat. Chicago was divided by race, by class, but everyone could get together at the bar and watch Jon Stewart, I remember, back in college. And it's funny because it kind of reminds me of, see, like Jared Taylor. I know he grew up in Japan, and it gave him a unique perspective on being white that he's kind of brought back with him to the Western nations, and people kind of freak out and don't like him because of it. They say he's racist. And it's a similar experience kind of growing up on the south side of Chicago, where you realize that you are not the majority and that people kind of have it out for you based solely on your race, not anything that you've done. And it creates this imbalance where you can't go into certain neighborhoods that are black because you're white, but the blacks are always welcome into the white neighborhoods. And to deny them access would be incredibly, racist and wrong of you. And obviously they're putting the moral judgment on race. But I think being around black people, you kind of realize that most of them aren't violent, right? Most of them are just people. And there are traits that are maybe more exaggerated in the black community, such as being loud, asking questions. But I've had so many just normal interactions with black people, so many black friends. It's the funniest thing is that I've had more black friends than anyone I know, not because I went out of my way not to be racist, but because simply as a product of my birth, of where I grew up, you have similar interests. A lot of nerds, a lot of them in Dragon Ball Z. Um, I have like I stay in contact with a couple of them. It's funny because I've made new black friends since moving to Michigan. Uh, just on accident. It's funny because nowadays a lot of people don't talk in public. They're on their phones. They're kind of heads down. But I can strike up a conversation with a black person. Maybe it's my superpower. But yeah, I agree with him completely. I run into this all the time. Up here in Michigan, I run into people that are very liberal. Michigan's more of like a battleground state, more divided than Illinois. I run into people, and so everyone in Illinois is like a champagne socialist, with the proper views on race, and they just don't go into the black sections, and they just kind of excuse black poor behavior, intelligence. They just use the racism or the slavery narrative to kind of understand and kind of bring it into the modern context of why they behave the way they behave. But up here in Michigan, I run into people all the time that have very positive views on black people that only interact with them once in a blue moon, or their version of black people deliver them
The
digitally.
blacks in South Africa. But now I want to go over a similar situation that happened in the United States. And I've read through, not necessarily cover to cover, but through several books about black people during what is called the Great Migration out of the South starting around 1890. And some of them talk about a single city, some talk about multiple cities, but it's all a variation on a theme about what happened in all these places. Before the end of slavery in the United States, only about 10% of the blacks in the U.S. were freedmen. And it's very important to distinguish between these two groups of blacks. I will refer to the antebellum freedmen, or free blacks who got their freedom before the Civil War, and
Remember, the antebellum, it's only 10% of the black population in the United States at the time.
postbellum freedmen who got their freedom from Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. These are two very different groups, and they function very differently. The Emancipation Proclamation occurred in 1863, though it only really went into effect in 1865 when the war actually ended. And northern cities around 1800 had race segregation laws. Laws limiting voting, laws limiting kinds and forms of employment, laws limiting property that blacks could have. However, as you get into the 1830s and 1840s, not only do these laws go away, but at least according to the authors I read, they describe a more liberal spirit toward the Negro, quote unquote, emerging. For example, in 1860, before the Civil War began a year later, there wasn't a single neighborhood in Detroit that was more than 50% black, i.e. there were no majority black neighborhoods. There was no black ghetto. In
You think about Detroit now, which I've been through Detroit, and it's about to talk about Chicago. That's just unbelievable. Things have changed so much, and it really shows these consequences of not understanding this stuff. And you wonder, here's the thing. I don't think that if they had the knowledge that we have now about race and IQ and the genetics and how these things are kind of changed, I'm not even sure if it would have changed things. The masses are controlled by these moral narratives, and they're set up by, Jewish controlled Zionist, whatever you want to call them, news organizations and the control of Hollywood, and the manipulation is just too strong, right? Facts don't even matter anymore.
Chicago,
And I don't know if they mattered back then.
2/3 of blacks lived in majority white neighborhoods, and the majority black areas were not considered ghettos.
There was also a study I remember a long time ago about Asians behaving differently when they're within their ethnic conclaves than when they're outside of it. And the same thing with Jews, and the same things with Indians. And I guess perhaps the same things with whites as well.
But then the Great Migration happened, and this is a period from about 1890 to 1910 where postbellum blacks started a mass movement out of the South into northern cities. And in all of these accounts, like clockwork, they say that the cities began to go back to segregation in various forms. And it wasn't always by law that this happened, as was the case in the South, but sometimes by organization and norm. Restrictive covenants would do the trick, which was just
Here, before he starts talking about restricted covenants, it's interesting because I'm an ANCAP, and so that's an anarcho-capitalist. And so people joke, people on this side of the internet joke that I've been corrupted by the Jews because anarcho-capitalism is a inherently Jewish ideology come up with by two Jews, Murray Rothbard and Milton Friedman. And the idea is that you can have a capitalist, system without the state, and it will produce more liberty. And the big sticking point in fact, I think even Ryan Falk, who made this video, I think he kind of turned away from anarcho-capitalism because of race because of these ideas. Because how can you talk about this ideal society, or it's not even ideal. I think there'd be different problems in an ANCAP society than what we have now, right? You wouldn't have national debt, you wouldn't have a centralized, violent, government, but you would have smaller, conflicts, smaller, bank crashes, smaller, every organization trying to print their own money, or trying to control whatever sector of the economy they can control. Um, Different problems if regulations can't be increased, or a police force can't be maintained properly. um, is it worth all that, right, just so that you don't have taxation as theft? Well, I guess that's a little outside the scope of this video. But the even Rothbard and um, Friedman, their their outline for the society is kind of based on like the free flow of commerce in like the Jewish ghetto, right? Where everyone has a similar cultural background and they all like know each other. And so it becomes much more difficult. I would argue not just to even just maintain capitalism, but to maintain any kind of, and when I say capitalism, I mean, private property ownership and, trading if you want to. But it becomes more difficult to even maintain that, and even maintain a democracy when you have all these stratified, you know, sections of society, and based on race, and you can't. It's not like a uniform that you can take off your skin. So, and it comes with identity. It comes with all these things. I went back to Chicago to pick up some people from the airport at O'Hara, and on the way there, I went through a Sam's Club in downtown Chicago, and literally I was eating chicken in the parking lot, and a gang of like 5 cars with trucks with Mexican flags painted on the front and huge Mexican flags like waving in the back. They pulled in the parking lot and they had like a little rally, and the security, no one did anything. They're all too scared. And like the founders, like America wasn't supposed to be this like divided among, I mean, I don't even consider Mexican like a race, right? It's a mixture of white admixture and Native American admixture. But they're clearly celebrating, they control Mexico, right? And now they're spreading into America, and so they're just celebrating themselves, right? And there's the other, and then there's them.
Just a deal that if you sold your house or rented it, it had to be sold or rented to a white person. If that was struck down by a judge as illegal, another thing that kept...
So the restrictive covenants, let me just touch on that, briefly. Completely moral, right? There's nothing wrong with the restrictive covenant. You control the property, you're setting up some sort of thing. And, again and again, right, people that want to support the state, the state is always, at least this state, at least anything that the West can currently produce, it's always going to be against you, white man. It's never going to work in your favor. The few things that you think are going to go in your favor won't. That's been my experience throughout your life. And so restricted covenant's completely moral, right? It's a completely moral, easy way to kind of keep your neighborhood ethnically homogenous, and the court struck it down because fuck freedom.
White neighborhoods, white was just pricing. Just like today, whites with money just bought nicer places, and very few black could afford a nice place. And even those blacks who could afford a nice place weren't really that bad to be around anyway, especially since this is before widespread affirmative action. So the rich areas don't really need segregation, which is perhaps why being racist, quote unquote, became more associated with poor whites as...
And I remember when he said this, it clicked for me, right? When I was talking about the Champagne Socialists, in Illinois, you don't need to, black people are fine. Look at this black person at work. Look at this black person that lives down the road from me. Racism then forever becomes associated with poor people, not with rich people. It's like almost like a hidden privilege they get.
As it was the poor whites who actually had to deal with these post-bellum blacks on a regular basis. But if you didn't have money and the court struck down a restrictive covenant, well, then your home and your neighborhood got destroyed by these post-bellum blacks. And I say this now...
Sounds like oppression. Sounds like oppression from the state.
now, and it's something considered really mean and racist to say that you bring blacks into an area and that destroys the area. But all these authors back then chronicling at the times, they just said it like this, even the black ones, because back then the norm that you couldn't say what was clearly going on, what clearly happened when blacks moved into an area, the norm that you couldn't say that hadn't been established yet, nor did any of all the narratives we have.
Think of our lives. Think of what we have to live with day in and day out. We are like the end result, the men of 2025, of the slow boiling the frog. I mean, we're already there. This is not the apocalypse. This is our dystopian future. You can't, the norm of what you can't say hadn't been established yet. You're gonna die. Everyone listening to this is gonna die. I'm Ryan. Ramsey Paul said something once where people were like, "Well, how can you say what you say?" He goes, "Well, no one's going to remember anything I say in 100 years. People may not remember what I say in 80 years. No one's alive that's in this argument right now is going to be around in 80 years." That kind of throws things into perspective. You gotta be brave. Be brave like Charlie Kirk.
Yeah, for example, all of these guys talk
Fuck it.
about postbellum blacks being more criminal and prone to vice and indolence, and
Vice and indolence.
narratives regarding police bias hadn't developed yet. So they would just say that the blacks were more criminal and this was bad, and this made it difficult for good things to happen, for people to develop careers, and for people, it made it hard for a community to form and any kind of collective economic stability to occur. What's also funny is that they would say that slavery had something to do with the problems of the postbellum black communities as they moved into the North, but they would say that it was the poor work ethic that they developed as slaves.
That is pretty funny. And if you watch some of the previous articles that he's done, that is true, right? When you are a slave and you're not getting rewarded for efforts, and there's no way to move up in your career as a slave, it doesn't, when you think about it, just for like maybe not a second, but man, for like 2 minutes, it does make sense. You're not going to be motivated to work, and you're going to develop bad habits. I've developed bad habits. A lot of people have developed bad habits. I think things are too comfortable in the West right now, and people are on social media too much. Here I'm recording this for a social media platform, but believe me, I try not to spend a lot of time online, and I feel like I'm going to fucking throw my phone away. I fucking hate my phone. It's literally evil. It literally steals your attention. I remember someone said something once that what you do in the morning when you wake up, that kind of time, you can tell like where your energy is going to go. You want to direct your energy towards, your art, towards your motivations, towards running, towards exercise, towards bettering yourself, towards your career, or you pull out your phone and start looking. Well, I don't have a girlfriend. Why isn't the world going my way? Well, maybe because you're staring at this evil black box.
Now, I know, and you could know if you wanted to, that black slaves in the South actually worked fewer hours per year than free white farmers did at the time, and certainly they weren't self-motivated. And I have a series talking about slavery that goes into all sorts of things like this, and it's linked in the description. But what's also interesting is that these guys writing about the past, they don't think as deterministically as sociologists do today. For example, an explanation for why a group behaves a certain way could be just that group chose to act that way. Why did a person mug this other person? Well, because you chose to be immoral and you chose to do that. Why are so many blacks in these northern cities engaging in vice and indolence? Well, because they are doing that. They made the choice to do that. That's not a way modern sociologists tend to think. They could just look at a group behaving a certain way and say that group shouldn't be behaving that way, and that the solution is to muster up the will to stop behaving that way.
Just using that language, right? You have control of your actions. You need to stop behaving this way, and you can make the decision to do it. That's so powerful, right? Not having that victim mindset. It's believe me, take it from me. It will change your life.
Sociologists today definitely do not think like this. To them, everything is ultimately determined by circumstance.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a sociologist, but I also wonder if they're just afraid. People just don't do things when people yell at them. It's like, stop yelling at me. Okay, I'll say what you want to say. Please stop yelling at me.
however complicated it may seem. Now, ending that digression, the same thing that happened into cities like Chicago, Detroit, Philadelphia, and New York also happened on the West Coast a little bit. In San Francisco and Portland, Oregon in World War II, when blacks started moving in to help with the naval buildup. San Francisco went from 5,000 blacks in 1940 to 40,000 blacks in 1950. And over that time, there became more restrictive covenants and white-only stores and restaurants throughout San Francisco. Now, segregation on the West Coast isn't as well known because the Civil Rights Act was passed 15 years later due to the influx of European Jews to the United States after World War II. But for a brief period, it also happened on West Coast cities as well, illustrating, and that's important.
And also, he just kind of breezed over that. But yeah, the civil rights era is something that the Jews kind of orchestrated to kind of help, dismantle white America. Um, we'll get into that later. I think it's in. I was just talking about this because we were talking about the Alex Linder thing a couple days ago. Linder. I gotta say Linder, not Lender. But he does audio recording on his website, Alex Linder, like front/audio something.com maybe. And on that, he goes audio book on the Leo Frank trial, and it's the third volume. The one I recommend is the third volume of The Secret Relationship Between Black and Jews by the Nation of Islam, which I've said in the past. I lived, like less than like 15 minutes from that church, Louis Farrakhan's church, and so that I think it's the second volume goes over the blacks associations with the civil rights movement or the Jews Association of the Civil Rights Movement. But I think it's also in The Jewish Revolutionary Spirit and Its Impact on World History by E. Michael Jones. There's a chapter where he talks about the Jews kind of behind Martin Luther King and the Civil Rights Movement and the Hart-Celler Act in 1965, which changed immigration and kind of the Jewish kind of struggle to get that passed and how it basically has destroyed the ethnic character of America.
Because it illustrates that this is a universal phenomenon. This is not something specific to southern cities or the South in general or to northern cities at a specific place in time, but also occurred in the West Coast. It also occurred in South Africa. This is a universal phenomenon. When blacks move in, whites have a instinctive reaction to segregate somehow. And today, the way whites segregate is different. It has to do with the buildup of the suburbs and leaving the cities, and the cities become what they become. So why did all of this happen? Why did all of these cities go from being open to blacks before the 1890s to being closed to blacks once the post-bellum freedmen started moving in? Well, there's a true dichotomy of explanation here. One is the obvious explanation that pops out at you, and the other is circles within circles retardation. So
I'm sorry. I just have to comment. I love the way he talks. Circles within circles of retardation. I can explain it. It's like I got a circle, and it's like a spiral going deeper and deeper and deeper. It gets more retarded the more you go. I love that.
We'll
Beautiful.
skip
I love his. He's a wordsmith.
the shit-lib circus explanation here, and we'll just go with what actually happened. The
Oh.
antebellum, right? Remember, the antebellum freedmen were the blacks who found a way to not be slaves, either buying it or doing a favor or whatever it is they had to do to find a way to stop being slaves. And so the difficulty of becoming a freedman before 1865, however difficult that was, I'm not exactly sure how hard that was, but whatever difficulty that was, that served as a filter. And I'm just going to have to be kind of rude about this, but it was obviously the higher quality blacks who managed to achieve freedom before general emancipation. This couldn't not be the case. It wasn't going to be on average worse quality people who managed to earn their freedom before.
But wouldn't it be funny if it was? Wouldn't that be like the ultimate like Mr. Magoo like style comedy about like a black guy that's like just really dumb and he manages to get like out of slavery before like all these like intelligent like hardworking black people and he's just like bumbling his way north like getting bitches, getting riches. That man, that I'm gonna write that down. That is a winner right there.
Or general emancipation. Now, sure, there could be some who just got lucky, but
also look at all this public filming and the people not freaking out. If this is like a First Amendment audit today, everyone here would be like, "Why am I on film? Get this film out of my face." People were just chillaxing back then before social media. God, I hate social media.
On the whole, the 10% of blacks who got their freedom were going to be smarter, better able to delay gratification, better able to plan ahead than the blacks who didn't manage to get their freedom before 1865. Unfortunately, statistics back then weren't as detailed as they are now, and it would be unlikely that the blacks in Detroit or Philadelphia in 1850, 13 years before Lincoln's General Emancipation Proclamation, would be exactly as wealthy as their fellow whites at the time were. Maybe the antebellum blacks were slightly poorer or slightly wealthier than their white peers in these cities, but the general perception was that of equality. So whatever the slight difference was, in whatever direction it went, wasn't noticeable to people at the time, or to people chronicling what was going on. And we can do some fuzzy math to get an idea of what free black IQ would have been back then. Now, one problem is that black slaves were mostly illiterate back then. Only about 20% could read, which was higher than the world average, also higher than Russia at the time, which was 15%. So black slaves, in a global sense, had it pretty good in terms of being literate. But what this means...
I always remember that statistic because it always shocked me. I remember when he first brought that up, years ago in like an article. I was just like, really? Like that many slaves were like could read and stuff? Wow, wow.
So when comparing IQs, we're really talking about a kind of genetic IQ potential, or what their IQs would have been if they weren't illiterate. So blacks today, their mean IQ is around 85 with a standard deviation of 13. So the top, not 15. So the top 10% of blacks today would start at an IQ of 101.6, slightly above the white average. However, the selection for IQ in earning freedom probably wasn't as strong, as again, there would be those blacks who just got lucky, and there would also be some really smart blacks who couldn't earn their freedom because their lord just wouldn't loosen his grip at all. And so if this number here isn't so much a minimum but an average, well then we're looking at antebellum freedmen having an IQ of around 102. Now, if you think that...
That's pretty good. Okay, so here, going back to my idea for the bumbling black getting his freedom long before all of his friends, maybe what happens is that one of the smart blacks, he like organizes like a work contract like with his owner, and he's able to like free himself that way. And he's like, well, if I do this extra work, or if I build this thing for you, then maybe I can get out. And the guy's really happy and has a family, but the racist slave owner can't tell the black people apart, so he lets the wrong person go, and that's like the beginning of our bumbling hero's journey north.
That the mean black genetic IQ was only 83 back then, because they had less white admixture at them, which is going to pull up, the average black quote-unquote IQ, as blacks today are around 24% European by admixture. And of course, we're dealing with
20% European by admixture. That's kind of the saddest thing about, the left, and it's kind of riling up like the racial stuff in America, is that modern day African Americans in the United States, they are genetically unique from Africans at any other point in history, right? Because they have so much white admixture, they can't go back to Africa. They can't reintegrate into some diaspora, is that what they call it, of like black existence. They just wouldn't fit in. They're too intelligent.
Racial hereditarian assumptions. Then, by my assumptions here, we would predict the IQ of antebellum freedmen to have an average IQ of around 99.7. So these 10% of blacks who were able to earn their freedom before the Civil War probably represented around the top 20% of blacks in terms of intelligence, ability to plan ahead, delay gratification, have self-control, etc. And we're not going to have trait regression to the mean that I talked about previously, because being able to earn your freedom isn't necessarily just selecting for IQ, but also selecting for these other things that you need to have in order to earn your freedom. Normally, when you have a black person with an IQ of 100, he still tends to have lower self-control, lower ability to plan ahead, lower ability to think abstractly than a white person with a similar IQ. So normally I would say if you have a population of blacks with an IQ of 100...
Oh, and I'm not sure if you can explain this, but regression to the mean just means that within like a generation or two, you go back to the average IQ of whatever racial group you are. So that one of the issues with like doing immigration, it's like a white country, and doing like an IQ test or something. And then, not that they do this, but if they did, right, the problem would be is that within a generation or two, the the children's of that person would then be dumb, right, or the regular IQ of their race, and then they're oppressed, and they can't get a good job as their parents, and people aren't looking at it from a genetics perspective. They're just looking at it from, well, their parents came from like India and they were smart, they had jobs, why can't they get a job, their offspring? Well, because racial back regression to the mean.
They're still going to be slightly lower, not quite as low as the black average and all these other traits, but they're going to sort of fall back on other personality traits. And this is just kind of a statistical phenomenon. When you have a massive deviation from the population you're from, the other traits tend to sort of go down in what I call trait mountain. However, in the case of the antebellum freedmen, because the filter itself is not necessarily just filtering for IQ, we don't know for sure what exactly it's filtering. Trait mountain probably did not exist with the antebellum freedmen, and that they were probably, in terms of all their personality traits across the board, not just IQ, they were probably about on par with whites. So what appears to have happened is that a population of blacks that was uncannily similar in their behavior to whites moved into northern cities. And guess what happened? They were treated like white people. Not right away. It took about a generation, fair enough, but there it was. And Thomas Sowell, throughout Black Rednecks and White Liberals, laments the Great Migration from the South that destroyed the situation where whites and blacks in northern cities actually were equal and actually did get along in due course. Because what is Thomas Sowell? Thomas Sowell is a black white person.
And this is the interesting thing, is the more information you learn about stuff like this, how does I mean, it's been so I used to be a leftist, right? So I wonder how a modern leftist receiving this information, how do you explain this? You just yell culture, culture, culture. It seems like the genetic explanation is the only thing that makes sense when whites weren't universally racist, and putting like the idea is that people were way racist in the past, and then through the civil rights movement and through the government cracking down, whites became less racist. How do you explain, these bumps in racism unless you're talking about genetics?
And he's a white person that just happens to be black. And he sees an aperture of history where all his hopes and dreams actually happened, where you had actual racial equality. And it wasn't.
And this is the problem with Thomas Sowell, right? Is that he's one of those people that's not looking at the big picture, right? He's not studying. It's like you ignore a whole branch of science. You're not studying IQ. You're not studying these things, and you're just basing your world off of your worldview, off of like what you wish, and you're projecting yourself onto other members of your own race. Not everyone thinks like you, Thomas.
Some retard political movement blithering about equality and justice, but from genetic similarity and fair treatment in a meritocratic society. It was a time and place where the beliefs about race that white conservatives today have actually were true and actually did happen, where you had the talented 20th of blacks who pulled themselves up
These ladies can't kick very. I can kick higher than all these ladies.
by their bootstraps and integrated and became part of white society. The old Republican dream made real. And as I said before, the bog standard oppression narratives we have today didn't exist back then. For example, high black criminality of recent black immigrants to Philadelphia, they wouldn't say, oh, the cops, they're just out to get the Negro. Because first off, they'd have to explain why the cops are unfairly targeting the postbellum freed blacks, when the cops obviously didn't target the antebellum freed blacks previously. And also because the whole meme about
God, that's a great point. How would you explain that, right? It's clear that this is a different character of black people moving into the neighborhood that is now committing crime and now being targeted by the police.
the police being particularly biased against blacks
I wonder why this
just
keeps
hadn't
going up.
been invented yet. And this also might be because there hadn't been much time since the blacks moved out of the South in the 1890s. So one could imagine that in time, these new blacks in Philadelphia would come to behave like the old ones did.
Yeah, well, they all look the same.
Which is to say, like white people. But start getting into the 1930s, 1940s, 1950s, and this is just not happening.
But it makes sense that to give them kind of some slack that the white people at the time would think that, especially like in a big city, because you're not exposed to like social media, you're not like traveling as much, so you're not seeing kind of the behavior of like Africans in like other parts of the world. You just don't know. You think that the way it's kind of like a cultural bubble, right? You think the way you behave and act is just like normal, and everyone will kind of change to kind of act like you in this culture.
So now
And they don't know anything about human biodiversity.
all the environmental determinists, they need new theories. Now, you and I sitting here, we have what is today some special knowledge. Not
Yeah.
actually because we're particularly smart,
No,
but
we are
just
smart.
because we happen to know a single thing that makes explaining the world so much easier. That is race differences in intelligence and all the traits that ride with intelligence and their genetic component. These
Yay!
average racial differences being primarily genetic, around 80% for IQ and probably even higher for self-control and ability to plan ahead. And so it's this strange kabuki theater where we can very easily see and explain what's going on, but to have to sit back and watch as the wizards on the stage there try to explain a genetic phenomenon without reference to genes. It reminds me of cities that have used predictive policing algorithms, and what ends up happening is the algorithm just tells them to send cops into black and, to a lesser extent, Hispanic neighborhoods. And I went over this in a video I made a while ago called The Rise of the Racist Robots. So they forbid the algorithm to use race as a criteria, and they
Bad algorithm. Algorithm's like, well, just go where people buy menthol cigarettes.
and so the algorithm ends up telling the police to go into areas that have a lot of menthol sales.
Oh, there you go.
And have liquor stores with check cashing services. And so they end up just telling police to do the same thing as when they explicitly use race. The algorithm finds a way to racially profile, even
Life
if you
finds
say
a way.
you can't racially profile. They find the correlates and end up telling you to do the same thing. And that's kind of what sociologists do, trying to explain racial equality in everything when they forbid genetic explanations. Of course, their environmental explanations always fail, and so they're always changing. So we're sitting here in the theater watching this retard trying to figure out this problem, and we keep telling him it's the genes, stupid. And when we say that, he screams at us and calls us racist for saying that, asks us what our credentials are, and then comes up with four-dimensional hyperloop white privilege inferred from quantum entanglement, and his super fragile explanation will of course last for about 10 years until some new trend shows up and shatters it. Meanwhile, we're sitting here in the theater yelling at these bozos, it's the genes, stupid. Don't you believe in evolution? The same explanation that explained what was going on in 1890 explains what's going on in 1990, and you're coming along with all these new exotic theories that get shattered over and over and over again because you just cannot bring yourself to believe in evolution and genes. All these perturbations and all these problems you're having to come up with, such complex theories to explain what can very simply and easily be explained by humans evolved in different places, and humans evolved adaptations to these different places. One of those adaptations was brain functions. And so,
It's funny. It's not haha funny, but more like pondering existence funny. That Charlie Kirk is shot yesterday for having pretty lukewarm, like conservative views. And this stuff is so much more controversial. I mean, I'll never probably be famous. I'll probably just rot away in obscurity. But I think, if Ryan Falk like did this at a university, I mean, it'd just be madness. These views are so much more controversial than anything, Turning Point USA, spews. And people can't even handle that. How are we ever possibly going to introduce these ideas into the mainstream? I don't know.
So they start off by saying that the great mass of black immigrants will just integrate just like the antebellum freedmen did. The postbellum freedmen will integrate just like the antebellum freedmen did. But then that doesn't happen. So then they move to the belief that, well, it's segregation and the Jim Crow laws and all the norms that are causing the poverty and the criminality of these blacks. Never did they imagine that they might have cause and effect reversed here, that segregation is really a form of quarantine and white people practicing civilizational self-defense, but never mind that for now. So we get the Civil Rights Act. And at the time, people who started pushing for racial quotas, what we call affirmative action, they believed that they would become unnecessary in about 10 years, 15 years at the most.
Think about that. It's been like 70 years now, over 70 years. Wow.
And we've seen how that played out. But Why wouldn't they think that? If segregation
I remember Molyneux did a video once where he was talking about a news reporter asking them about affirmative action and how much longer we have to keep doing it. And they're like, oh, this is just the beginning. And he's like, wait, it's just the beginning? It hasn't worked. It's just the beginning. This is like when affirmative action had been going for like 60 years.
segregation's the problem. And in addition to ending segregation, you're also giving
You still have money, Whitey.
racial quotas and privileges. Well, damn if we don't make some serious progress towards this great thing we're supposed to want, which is racial equality. Well, we're 53 years on from that, and there's been virtually zero progress towards this goal we're supposed to have.
Guy!
And our brilliant intellectuals, all of our wizards, have come up with these new and exotic forms of white privilege, implicit racism, how implicit bias perpetuates white supremacy, and the whole fucking word salad. And of course, our great intellectuals, they don't deny genetic differences between two individuals. No. Sure, some people, by dint of their genes, will be better at math than other individuals. That is something that is so experientially true that when trying to teach a new math concept to two people in the same classroom for the first time, that we have seen one person just gets it and the
Oh, Ryan, don't say it's just experientially true. I mean, people don't believe their lying eyes these days.
other person doesn't. And over and over
Where's your credentials?
and over again. One person gets it, the other person doesn't. And to deny this experienced visceral reality, it would just break all of your credulity and people would just stop listening to you. And of course, if you look at two groups of individuals, maybe people from the east side of the tracks versus the west side of the train tracks, there would be some genetic difference in average intellectual abilities between these two arbitrarily defined groups. Don't know exactly what it would be, but certainly there would be some difference, right? These great intellectuals, they have to accept that because this is obviously true. If you took two random groups of people, there would be some average intellectual difference. But as soon as the groups you're drawing lines around happen to correspond to the historical colloquial races, then stop. No, those must be the same. As soon as the groups you draw the lines around become the races or correspond with the races, then they're the same.
You know, we're asking a lot of intellectuals and researchers. I know this, but you have to be brave. I mean, this is, we're asking for a Superman. Someone that can do the research and also kind of come out and say this. And you see the guy that discovered the double helix in DNA. He came out and was talking about race and IQ, and they took his prize away from him, and he got fired. So people are just on the chopping block. Look at COVID. Look how quickly people kind of bend to authoritarian will.
Individual genetic differences? Sure. Arbitrarily defined group genetic differences? Sure. But if those arbitrarily defined groups correspond to the colloquial races, then they must be the same. And I say this, and it's really...
It's also funny, too, because this is... People don't even talk about the intelligence differences with women, right? Or the physical differences between men and women. They're too afraid to talk about that. And those are experientially true as well.
Really, really stupid what this is, what they do, how they think. And it's maddening for me to try to explain this to normal people because these wizards who deny genetic differences between the races, they are so balls in your face stupid that literally the whole of social science in 90% of universities are literally as stupid as I'm describing here that it's hard for the average Joe to believe it. It's so big. It's so balls in your face stupid.
But it also shows the need that humans have to belong and to be moral, or at least think they're being moral, right?
But that the average Joe just doesn't believe me. There's no way that these fucking wizards could be so dumb because it's so big. It's so many universities. I mean, I'm talking about Harvard, Yale. I'm talking big fucking names, and I'm saying it's this obviously stupid. They're making an error this obviously stupid for so long. And I say this and people just, it's too much. If this were true, someone would have called it out a long time ago. That's how the average person thinks. And I can't blame them for thinking that way. And what's also difficult is that when you're talking to a low IQ person, they like to use low IQ indicators to figure out what's true and false. This means, university tenure. This means credential. Who's the academic? Say I'm arguing with an academic. The arguments will eventually become technical. Now, never mind that the person I'm arguing with, his position is literally impossible once you accept freshman level genetics concepts. The fact is he can spin jargon and I can respond to his spun jargon, and we're both saying things that the audience doesn't understand. And so the listener ends up just going with, well, I don't understand either of these guys, but one is a credentialed academic, the other is just some guy on the internet, so I'll go with the credentialed academic. Even though the people who actually study this particular topic on race differences in intelligence.
No, Ryan. I mean, I know he's wow, he's really going off. I forgot about the end of this video, but it's not that, buddy. It's, people, they don't want to lose their job, man. They don't want to not get a girlfriend. There's a million reasons people don't believe you.
Agree more with me than they do with the fucking wizards. Okay, there's actually surveys on intelligence researchers. No, guess what? They agree with me, not with the wizards.
Not in the West, right? We did that article. I think it's people in China. It's people spread all around the world, or in less diverse areas like Poland and Nova Scotia or whatever.
Of Lysenko. And that's also kind of why I've been trying to get some academics to openly support what I say, not because they necessarily have some great arguments to add, though sometimes they do, but primarily I need those funny hats. Right? I need to be able to say, look, we got a wizard hat here, and I can put on, and I can sort of, put on the wizard hat and say, look, I'm an academic now, all right? Or at least I'm endorsed by these particular academics. So I got the wizard hat, he got the wizard hat. So now can we move past funny hats and talk about the topic itself? So,
it's interesting that Ryan doesn't believe that if he did go through academia, that he would gain like a specialized knowledge that would change his opinion on the subject. I think it's so experientially true that one of the things that happens when you're in school is you get brainwashed and you kind of know what not to say. You're pressured, not to, talk about this subject, or if you do a race and IQ study, it's just to deny it. I mean, there's so many examples of this happening. What was that book? The Jared Diamond book, like Guns and Germs and Steel. That one, it's not a bad book. Ryan actually did a video where he goes through it and kind of debunks several points of it. And there's some interesting stuff in there. I don't know if I want to go through the whole thing like this one, but it's more it's more just a kind of couple select points that I thought were really interesting. Like I remember there's a part where Jared Diamond is talking about the domestication of rice, and Ryan kind of corrects him and says that it just kind of happened, evolutionarily wise, that humans were intelligent enough to all domesticate rice at about the same time around the world, about like within like whatever it is, like 50 years of each other. And it would seem like they're trading knowledge, but they're not, right? It's just genetics at work. So there's interesting stuff like that. But the end of that book is fucking crazy, where Jared Diamond goes off in this whole thing about how it's all this coincidence and people just had resources and people couldn't get to these resources and blah 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 blah. And he downplays intelligence and genetics and IQ, but like people aren't regularly talking about genetics and IQ. So it's kind of like someone telling on themselves, right? When they're like, these are the arguments that they're receiving maybe in the background, or they know it's true, but they can't reveal it. They can't talk about it. So they have to kind of smear it. And it's like, dude, we weren't even discussing that. Why are you thinking about it?
And I've spent years going on about twin studies and inferring heritability and subtest heritability differences, looking at mixed populations and what is the most parsimonious explanation, going down into frickin' South American countries and looking at granular distributions of admixture showing, very clear trends in mixed populations. And any honest observer will go through this ocean of evidence that we've been building up, and they will just say, yes, evolution happened in humans above the neck in the past 100,000 years. And there's regional differentiation. Right? There is, in fact, divergent evolution. Just as with skin color, just as with every other part of the body, there's also divergent evolution regarding the brain, and not just size and shape, which has been confirmed nowadays through MRI scans. Gould was wrong, Gould lied, right? There are differences in brain morphology today. And surprise, surprise, these differences in brain morphology seem to correspond to some differences in function, just as you would predict with literally any other animal being studied. And now we're actually finding within population validated gene correlates with intelligence that differ by population. And a while ago, and it's been a meme for so long, at least among me and my little group, that we would joke about idiots who think you have to find the genes to infer heritability. And that's really stupid, right? Because you would deny basically the heritability of any trait before we could ever find any gene for anything. And you would say, well, we have no idea if heredity even exists because you gotta always find the gene. And just how stupid that is. But
Well, yeah, you can see heritability in, phenotypes.
we're at the door of literally being able to find the gene for population differences and individual differences in intelligence right now. And sure, they try to dismiss the work of David Piffer. They'll find some problems with the study, and guess what? Every study has problems, right? Finding some imperfection in a study doesn't. And I've argued about that and how Piffer's work is perfectly valid. But even if you forget all that, even if you say Piffer's full of crap, even if you say all the criticisms are sustained, any rebuttal of the criticisms are all bogus, even if Piffer is totally off base, boy, are these people missing the point. Piffer is just the first swing of the axe, buddy. There's a lot more swings coming, and this door is splintering apart. Even if Piffer didn't make the breakthrough, Piffer's just one guy. Piffer's just the first swing. And we're going to be in a situation where we've built a society on assumptions of racial equality, and then 20 years later, we'll have something like the 23andMe thing, except it tells you something like a genetic intelligence potential or genetic intelligence value, and we're going to be in a very strange situation where you have all of the wizards casting the spells of...
Ryan, this is the problem with being a brain in the jar, is we're not going to be in that situation. They'll never let it happen. They'll pass a law. The violence of the state will come down before that.
Environmental determinism when we actually have uncovered the genes. And guess what? They're going to differ by population. There's no way they can't. There's no way they won't. And like with the genetic ancestry data, it's very much like that situation in a skit on Family Guy with Peter and Quagmire, where Peter kept saying something inane, and Quagmire just goes, you know what, I'm just going to move the conversation forward. And then Quagmire did. He talked about, what we should do based on X. When Peter kept on denying X, Quagmire just said, you know what, we're just going to go forward. X is true. Let's talk about it now. Right. And that's kind of what happened with race denial and the 23andMe stuff. Pete, you had these goobers saying race doesn't exist because I don't know what categories are, and I like to say more variation within the between because I don't know what genetic drift or the difference between coding and non-coding sequences are, right? They'll just say these garbage race denial arguments, and then meanwhile you had these companies that were kind of like Quagmire, where they just said, okay buddy, anyway, meanwhile here's a genetic test that'll just tell you your race, right? So I mean, it's over. Like we've moved the conversation forward. People who are denying race, they're like Peter in this skit, right? Okay, well, and anyway, companies like Ancestry.com and 23andMe, they've just skipped. They just said, yeah, we're moving the conversation forward. Here's how we're actually going to delineate the races here. And they might not say races, they'll say populations or whatever. Kind of like Neil Cavalli Sforza had a book called The Races of Man. It was published in the 1970s and later it was republished, but the publisher was saying, oh, you can't use race. And so he literally had it in a Word document and did a global word replace population with race. and he sent it in. It was literally just a global, like you would do on a Word document. That's literally all he did. All right, so anyways. So no doubt, even when you have the equivalent of a Ancestry.com test or 23andMe genetic test that gives you a genetic intelligence value, no doubt that even then you'll have the wizards come out and say, somehow that's not real. Somehow this doesn't say what it says. And just as people today don't deny biological race, that's kind of a non-starter. By the time we get to that point, the whole denial of a genetic intelligence value is just going to be a non-starter because there's just going to be a fucking app. We're just going to have an app that European countries that like to chide the United States about how their cities are functional. Even places like Portland, Oregon, or Pittsburgh, that are intelligence, they're just going to be like Peter on that couch. In the United States, you had the real city. And then you had the quarantined area where the blacks were. When the blacks moved into these northern cities in order to keep the cities functional, these post-Bell.
I like when he says, keep the cities functional, because that's literally what we're missing. We're missing, functional cities. Chicago is technically a functional city, but you have roaming gangs of violent criminals that are black, going in, breaking into shops. There was just a video the other day about a California shop that got ran into by a car, and the whole place got like raided in like broad daylight. And so, yeah, this is the quarantine function to make sure the city functions properly. Come on. Oh no 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 no.
Still majority white for whatever reason. They're rated as some of the nicest cities to live in. And European countries will laugh at the United States. Why don't your cities work? Why don't you have nice mass transit? Or Japan will say, why don't your cities work? Why aren't you all spread out into suburban sprawl? And in the past, in the United States, you had the real city. And then you had the quarantined area where the blacks were. When the blacks moved into these northern cities in order to keep the cities functional, these post-Bellum blacks had to be quarantined. But in 1965, at the latest, and in some places it was even sooner, the quarantine was broken. And the civilizational self-defense of whites was made illegal. And blacks took over most of these cities. And these cities...
God, that's such another great point. The civilizational self-defense of whites was made illegal. No one is entitled to live around you. Other races act like they're entitled to live amongst whites. That's not true. I can't go someplace and say I'm entitled as a white person to live with you. Um, yeah, civilizational self-defense and made illegal. It shows, it switches the oppression narrative, right? And I see on Twitter, I see that a lot where people have the integration being used at the end of a gun. You have like guys with bayonets forcing people to go to like integrated schools. That's not privilege.
Cities became as of Africa. And when someone blathers about oppression and racism, look, what happened in Detroit, what happened in St. Louis, what happened in the south side of Chicago, this is exactly what the segregationists said would happen. And this is what they were trying to prevent.
And they couldn't prevent it. And yeah, that's where we are. Wow. A lot more depressing than I remember this. I remember the first couple times I watched this video, I really got like fired up. I mean, I thought it was great. Was there an article that I missed based on this video? I don't think there was. Um, Besides, I don't think any of these links work anymore. Yeah, because the site's down. I wish he put his site back up. Um, Maybe next time we'll do the race mixing video. I remember this one being pretty good, where he talks about like the differences between interracial and same race couples. Yeah, maybe I'll do this next time. I don't know. This is just kind of me hanging out, going through one of his videos. Check it out. That's all. Spencer McGrill. Like and subscribe if you want to hang out with me in the future and watch or just check out some of his content. Don't wait for me. Yeah. All right. Bye-bye.